Now for today's program. Joseph Berger was a New York Times reporter, columnist, and editor for over 30 years, writing about education, religion, and the colorful kaleidoscope that is New York City, as well as chronicling many of the events that have shaken Israel and the Middle East. In 2011, he was honored with the Peter Kiss Award for a distinguished career given by the city's oldest press club, the Society of Solarians. Joseph is the author of 5 books, including Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust, which was chosen as a notable book of the year in 2001 by the Times, and is a memoir about his family's experience as refugees in New York in the 1950s and 1960s. Joseph's most recent book is Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. Nadine Epstein is an award-winning journalist and author. Since 2004, Nadine has been the editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine, which was co-founded by Elie Wiesel in 1975. She is also the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Nadine speaks widely about anti-Semitism and is the editor of Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Her most recent book is RBG's Brave and Brilliant Women, 33 Jewish Women to Inspire Everyone, which she wrote in collaboration with the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Please welcome Joseph Berger and Nadine Epstein.
Thank you, Suzanne. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Nadine. Nice to be here.
I was fortunate, you were fortunate, and I was fortunate to know Elie Wiesel, and I got to know him in the last 12 years of his life, because he was co-founder of Moment almost 50 years ago, which is amazing to think of that. And I met him because of that, and he became a mentor and a friend. And he was always very kind to me and generous with his time and his support.
To me as well. Yeah.
And I'm always thinking about how when we think we know someone, there's always really so much we don't know about them. I always think about perhaps really the knowing someone is to be continually learning about them, constant learning about them. And I thought about this a lot because in 2016, after he died on July 2nd in 2016, I was at his funeral, and I was walking back down Fifth Avenue towards Penn Station to go back to DC, and I was, thinking about his legacy, and I decided to put a book together, which we did, Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. And I got to really know him so much better than I knew him by interviewing all these people and thinking about him and learning about him. So I was so delighted to, when I've been reading your book over the last few weeks, to learn even more about Elie. Joe Berger's book is Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. For me, it filled in so much about his youth, his time in France, especially Elie's career as a journalist, which I think most people don't know about, the transformation of a young Holocaust survivor into a spokesperson for all survivors, into a renowned writer and a speaker, but more than that, a unique voice, and I would argue an irreplaceable voice. So I just want to commend you, Joe, because you really captured the arc of Elie's life, and the book is really well reported and written. And I want to thank you for being here today to talk about the book.
Thank you. Thank you for those nice words. So,
well, before we talk about Elie, you come from a very unique vantage point that I think most people wouldn't know about. You're the son of Holocaust survivors yourself, and I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about your family, where you were born, and your family.
That's a long story, but I'll be glad to say some of it. My mother was born in and lived in Otvatsk, which was a resort town outside of Warsaw that drew many people for the summer because of its very crisp, fresh air. My father lived in a very small farming village, very, very primitive actually, with horse-drawn carts and all that. No electricity. In a place called Berger, which is now in Ukraine, but was then in eastern Poland. And when the Nazis invaded, my mother had a brother who was a kind of a communist sympathizer, and she fled with him to the Russian area of Poland, come under Russian domination. And from there, she ended up in the Ural Mountains. And my father was drafted into the Russian army because he was living in the Russian sector of Poland, and he ended up in the Soviet army, and he was sent to a labor town in eastern, also in the Ural Mountains, and that's where he met my mother. They married in 1943, and I was born in 1945. They learned in 1945 that almost all their brothers and sisters, my father had 6 sisters, my mother had 8 brothers, sisters, and step brothers and sisters, had been killed. 1 brother survived of my mother's. My father had nobody, and they came to the United States. They went back to Poland to learn all that, and then they went on to displaced persons camps, where my brother was born. And in 1950, we managed to get a visa to the United States. And I grew up on the Upper West Side and then the Bronx.
Okay, so when did you first learn about Elie? I mean, it was Jewish world Holocaust survivors in New York.
Parents used to go to the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Organization annual commemoration, later sponsored by the successor organization, the American Gathering of Holocaust Survivors. So Elie seemed to be there every year to speak. And unlike other survivors, he was eloquent in English. He had this gift for the haunting phrase. He was also very charismatic looking, and I think that drew people to him as well. And it's not really known that Elie came to prominence initially as a speaker. Night didn't do that well when it came out, it came. I think it gained the audience it did because Elie seeded that audience through his wonderful talks that he would give, and he had a way of talking about the Holocaust that no one else did, and kind of grappling with issues like where was God that no one else was taking on, and people were drawn to that.
Well, where did you first meet him?
The first time I saw him up close, in 1973, the New York Post sent me to Israel to cover the Yom Kippur War. And it was towards the end of the war because they were late in realizing that it wasn't going to be another 6-day war. And on the plane going to Israel was Elie and his friend Sigmund Strochlitz. The two of them had their shoes off and their ties loosened, and they were humming Yiddish melodies to each other. And I was enchanted by that. And I didn't actually go up to him and say anything. I was just watching and looking, and I was very, very charmed by that. That was the first time I saw him. The first time we spoke was when he won the Nobel Prize, and the Times asked me to do a profile of him. So I was at the 92nd Street Y, and Elie spoke at a press conference there, and afterwards he and I spoke. And it was notable because I asked him, what was God's role? Why? How can you go on believing in God and trusting in God and after what happened during the Holocaust? He said, sometimes I argue with God about that, and sometimes that draws me closer to Him. I thought that was beautiful.
So you were really struck by him. There was a beautiful passage in your book, which I'm going to read, which is because I thought you put together something about Elie that was said very well. As a writer, he could shape sentences that shimmered, and he was blessed with an orator's ability to intone his sentences dramatically. His Sorbonne and his Talmudic education enabled him to plumb the Holocaust philosophical and theological implications in an accessible way. His authority was strengthened by the way he had wrestled with the catastrophe in night. The power of his spoken words was enhanced by a tender musical voice, a furrowed face, and doleful eyes. Most survivors had missed out on the years of advanced education, so there were few who could match his blend of attributes. Soon everyone wanted Wiesel to speak, and so Wiesel became the de facto spokesman for the survivors.
The way I like to see it is that he filled a gap. After the war, and there was not very much spoken or written about the Holocaust. After the initial stories in the press, then people kind of put it aside because I think the survivors were too traumatized to want to deal with it publicly, and Americans may have felt some guilt that they didn't do. American Jews may have felt some guilt that they didn't do more to rescue the survivors, to put pressure on the White House to rescue the survivors, or rescue the 6 million that were killed. So Elie emerged to fill that gap, and because he had the gifts that you just described, and because of that, he became the torchbearer for the Holocaust survivors. He exhumed the Holocaust from the dustbin of history, to put it another way.
Yes. Well, you're the child of Holocaust survivors. You're a journalist, and I'm just wondering what made you want to write a book about Elie? Was there something to you? He meant something to you personally, more than just somebody you had written about, or.
Absolutely. I got to know him over the years after those events I described. And he would, often call me up and complain about something at the New York Times, or praise something that he saw. We talked quite a bit. So I got to know him somewhat. But I also was asked to write his obituary, his advance obituary, 10 years before he died. After he died, his story was on the front pages of all the newspapers and on television, and of course, you began to realize this was a person that needed a biography, and particularly because the arc of his life is so fascinating. Think about it. He's a Hasidic boy growing up in Sighet, this little small Hungarian town. His grandfather was a Visionist Chassid. He excelled in Talmud. If there had been no war, he would have ended up probably being a Hasidic rabbi or a teacher in that village. How did that person, that Hasidic boy, become this universal spokesman for the Holocaust and for genocide everywhere? That was the arc that I tried to capture in my book. And how that happened.
Well, by the way, I think he would have become Hazan, not so much a rabbi. He was really into music, but that's just my thought on it. But I think you're absolutely correct. It's a really important question, and you answer it.
Well, he certainly loved to sing, and he even gave a concert at the 92nd Street Y. In 2010, where he sang a whole bunch of familiar Yiddish songs.
He was a choral director when he was a young person. I remember when he was in Paris, he was a choral director. So he did in France. He was a choral director. So he had a lot of musical background, which I think most people don't know about him. And
he even had violin lessons when he was a boy. So yes, there was definitely a musical track he could have gone on.
Yeah. So, this kind of love for the Talmud and music and prayer that he had as a young, adolescent, influenced his life. How did it influence his life? How did it influence his work? How did it make him? How was it? Why was that so important, do you think?
Well, he always loved the rituals, the Jewish rituals. He never quite gave them up, even when he was very cynical about what had happened during the war. And he even kept a photograph of his house in Sighet on the wall where he did his work, just to remind himself that that's where he came from, and that having some of the wealth he acquired and some of the fame he acquired would not take him away from the fact that he was that humble. He came from that humble abode.
So you also really filled in a lot of details for me about his life when he's orphaned after the war, and he then goes to a special orphanage that's for boys like him, that's in France, and then he goes up to Paris and he studies at the Sorbonne. And I was wondering, like, how you feel that period of time that he spent at the Sorbonne, where he never actually got a degree, I think, but he took lots and lots of classes. How did that end up influencing him throughout his life?
Well, he took a Talmudic cup, a Talmudic brain, like Elie's, and applied it to the philosophy and the literature he was studying at Sorbonne, and he was able to kind of combine the subtlety of a Talmud student to apply to the great philosophers, and that kind of shaped his teaching as well as his writing.
So one of the things I really liked about the book was that you actually, I guess you must have read most of his books, that he wrote a lot of books, right? Elie wrote 50 books.
And he did.
And you read most of them for the book?
I didn't read 50 books, but I read quite a few.
Okay.
I mean, he wrote a wonderful book on the Hasidim called Souls on Fire, which everyone should read if you want to have an introduction to what it means to be a Hasid. He wrote some wonderful novels about, for example, one novel about revenge. And though he said it in Israel, and with an Israeli Haganah soldier who's been ordered to kill, to put a gun to the head of a British captain, if the British executed a Jewish fighter, then it was his job to execute the British fighter. And he taught the whole conversation about revenge really applies to the feelings of Holocaust survivors after the war, many of whom felt the need for vengeance. And so this book is very subtle in dealing with that theme.
Well,
So,
go ahead.
And there were many other books that he wrote, which I could talk a bit, but I don't know.
I'll ask you a little bit about them in a second, okay? But I loved how you tied the books into what was going on in his life at the time when he was writing them. I thought that was very helpful. And I wanted to start with Night, because, obviously his first book was Night. Do you think it's the most important book that he wrote?
I do, mainly because it's been read by 14 million people, or at least 14 million people bought the book. And it has become the kind of a key Holocaust text, where people get a sense of what life in a concentration camp was like in very granular fashion, the brutality, the violence is all there, and how people managed to survive, including Elie. I mean, if 2 more days had gone by, Elie would have been dead. So and so Night influenced so many people, and it is taught regularly in schools across the country. Many of which are in towns or states that require Holocaust education. So that was certainly the most important of his books.
But yet, I know from talking to Elie that writing was very important to him, and every day he spent time writing. And I was wondering how you think he felt as a writer about being known for Night. People mostly had read Night. And did he have other books that he thought were as important or more important?
Well, he would have liked to have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and I guess sometimes he resented the fact that people only thought about Night. But I think he also knew that it had the influence it had, and it was reissued in the translation by Marion, his wife. So clearly he realized how important it was. And yes, in that translation, he also included two other novels, two novels in addition to Night. So yes, he was probably bridging Night to his other work.
Okay. Well, one of my favorite parts of the book was about Elie as a journalist. He and I talked about that a lot. And of course, that's one of the things that led him to Found Moment in 1975. But people really don't know about his long, 25-year career as a somewhat tortured young man being a journalist, a self-tortured young man being a journalist, and not having much money, being pretty broke. But how did he get to New York? How did he become a journalist? I mean, I know he was we could focus on the New York part, but when he got to New York as a journalist, what was he doing, and what was life like for him?
Well, a lot of these things were happenstance.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't intend to become a journalist. He applied to Irgun because he wanted to join the War of Independence and join either the Haganah or one of the other militias. He ended up in Irgun's office. They turned him down because he was too frail. But they said to him, maybe you'd like to work on our newspaper. And I think they saw him as, a clerk or as some kind of menial, something that wasn't very, they didn't think of him as a writer or an editor. But while he was there, he started writing stories for them. And so that's how he became a journalist. He eventually, just to keep it, kind of summarized, he eventually became a correspondent for Yediot Achronot, first in Paris, and then he was sent to New York to become the UN correspondent. But while he was there, he covered the civil rights era. He covered the marriage of Marilyn Monroe to Arthur Miller. He covered a lot of different stories. He got to know Abba Eban. He got to know Golda Meir, and that's how he became a journalist. And it was as a journalist that Night came about, because he was in Paris trying to interview Pierre Mendes France, and he realized that he might get to Mendes France through Francois Mauriac, the Nobel Prize winning writer. The two of them had a conversation, and Mauriac learned about his Holocaust background and said, you ought to write it up. He said, well, I already have. He had a 800-page manuscript in Yiddish, and he cut it down, obviously, and that became the French version of Night. It was a hard sell. Many publishers turned it down, but finally they managed to get first a French publisher and then an English publisher.
Well, I just want to say I had a little bit of different, I had talked to him about writing and journalism, and he had told me that he always liked writing as a young person, that he had thought in his mind someday that he might grow up to be a writer. It was something that he had thought about even when he was an adolescent, but he wasn't something, and he also had noticed journalism as a young man because his dad, although he was a yeshiva boy, and he didn't read newspapers because he read the Talmud, and reading newspapers was not something that was a yeshiva boy did, but his dad did. And his dad read Der Moment, which was the Yiddish paper that came out of Warsaw, and it was a daily paper. And he would look at it he would look at it on the kitchen table. So he told me that after the war, he thought about what he might want to be, and he thought he might want to be a writer, and he might want to be a journalist. So just, it's a conversation that he and I had.
I wish I had interviewed you more at length about that. I would have included it in the book. That's fascinating. It's a wonderful story.
Yeah, he's told me a few stories like that. So I just wanted to know, so, when did he stop being, he was a journalist, and I guess at a certain point he really stopped being a journalist, and he became a spokesperson for the Holocaust. He became a speaker. He became a public figure. When did that happen?
Well, it's very interesting. As I said, there was this silence about the Holocaust. But in 1967, when the Israelis had this miracle victory in the Six-Day War, defeating the armies of Egypt and Syria and Jordan, there was a kind of surge of enthusiasm among Jews who wanted to know more about Jewish history and also about the Holocaust. And synagogues began inviting speakers, and the speaker they quickly learned was most fitting was Elie, and he with the help of some rabbis, his name was dispersed around the country, and then Elie began speaking. And so as a speaker, he came to certain kind of prominence. And of course, he also, as a journalist, took a trip to the Soviet Union to see the persecution and oppression of Jews there. And he wrote a moving book that became also like a text for the movement to free Soviet Jews. The Jews of Silence was the name of the book.
When we interviewed Natan Sharansky for our book that we did, Natan Sharansky said that was the most important thing that Elie did in his life. He thought that was Elie's true legacy, is that Elie played that role. But yes, so becoming a spokesperson for the Jews in Soviet Union was a major part of this.
Yes, absolutely.
So in the 80s, and I'm jumping around because obviously you've covered his whole life, and these were just a few things that popped out. Elie is appointed to be the chair of the first Holocaust Commission ever in the United States by Jimmy Carter. And first of all, he says no at first, because he says, I'm not the right person. I'm not an administrator. I'm a writer. I'm a philosopher, but I'm not an administrator. But he does do it anyways. But it's very difficult for him because he has these very high standards of how the Holocaust should be portrayed, or whether it can be portrayed. And he's very conflicted, and he's conflicted for many years about this. And tell us a little bit about this conflict in him.
Well, he had a sense that there was a certain sacred purity to the Holocaust, to the memory of the Holocaust, that could only be disturbed by something flashy or gimmicky, and shied away from any of that. This is a person who wrote a landmark article blasting the film, the series Holocaust, because he felt it trivialized and distorted the Holocaust itself. So, here in the Holocaust committee, he was very skeptical about a lot of the plans that people were making. He also was very insistent that the Jewish victims be the center of any monument. But ultimately, he spent so much time talking about the philosophy behind a monument and the philosophy behind a museum, and that it became also like a debating society, and nothing got built. And they only when Elie resigned and they gave more the authority, the chairmanship to a guy who built shopping malls, and he got it built because he hired an architect. He knew how to do those things. Elie was not a person of practical wisdom. He was more of a thinker and more of an abstract thinker.
But he never let any of his Night or any of his books ever be made into film for that reason too, though, is that he felt so how the Holocaust was depicted, which leads me to, he really, one of the things that's very special about him and what he did was that he felt the Holocaust was very, central to history, but he also recognized that there were other genocides. And I'm wondering, when did he start speaking about that? And actively, and becoming an activist for genocides were going around the world. And I know he often wrote, by the way, and other survivors did, they somehow had come away with the idea that the Holocaust would end genocides. And they were horrified that it didn't. And so what brought him, when did he start speaking about what was going on in Bosnia, what was going on in Rwanda, what was going on in Cambodia?
I would say he started to immerse himself in other genocides in the mid 70s. I think probably the first major issue he got involved with was the Vietnamese boat people. Here, people were trying to escape the new regime in Vietnam, and they started taking these flimsy boats across oceans, across seas, and he wondered why the countries that these boats would land in didn't take people in. And it reminded him of what happened with the refugees during the war. So he started talking up about that and called attention to it. And he, as a reporter who died recently did as well, Henry Kam. And so, and in fact, Henry went with him to Cambodia, to the area outside Cambodia,
Bosnia,
to talk about what was happening to the Cambodians under a regime that was probably killed 1 million people.
Didn't he also go to Bosnia? Because he also wrote, wasn't he the reporter who said he was so amazed because Elie spent so much time with the refugees and by speaking to so many refugees? And was that also Henry Kam?
Well, he recommended to Bill Clinton that he intervene, and he did it very publicly at the dedication of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. He said, he told Bill, "Why is the United States allowing this to go on? This is what I saw happen as a teenager in Europe, and now we're seeing Bosnians being killed, slaughtered in pits and by the thousands, and within a year, I'm not saying that this is the only reason Clinton intervened, but within a year, the United States did intervene in Yugoslavian situation.
I'm going to just jump back a little bit here, because I think it's a topic that's so important. And, Germans were a very complicated topic for Elie. And they're a very complicated topic for many people I know especially people who lived through World War II. And he would often say that it was not his job to forgive the Nazis. He wouldn't be able to forgive the Nazis. But how did he feel about Germans who were born after the Holocaust, who had been children during the Holocaust? There's a lot more complexity there. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
He was very clear that the people who committed the acts of the Holocaust were the ones who were guilty. Their children and grandchildren were not. And he made that very clear in Germany several times. He said, but your obligation is to remember what happened and do what you can to make sure it doesn't happen again. But he was very clear that they were not to be chastised or scorned because their parents had joined in the Nazi slaughter.
That was actually pretty controversial, I think, in many ways. I grew up in a home where we didn't buy anything made in Germany. And, no one would ever be caught dead driving in a German car or a German alarm clock or anything. I mean, it was very...
camera, or yes.
Anything. And so I think, it was he was ahead of his time, I think, in that, having that kind of conversation with people. So one thing I wanted to know, well, you spent all this time writing a book. It was like a 4 or 5 year process of writing the book. Was there something that you learned about Elie that surprised you in the process of writing the book? Or
a couple of things. First of all, his candor. Here's a man who's seen as a saint as a near saint by many of his admirers, a prophet almost. But he writes it very intimately about his inability to form a romantic relationship after the war. He talks about girls he would see on the train and chat them up, or in a movie theater in one case, and somehow he couldn't quite ask them out, begin to flirt with them, and of course he was hobbled by his guilt, his yeshiva training, and his guilt at that. He was learning things that he'd never seen before, but he talks about it very candidly. The other thing that also struck me was he had this tendency to over dramatize, which I noticed in a couple of cases. One that I found really interesting was he writes about his rivalry with Isaac Bashevis Singer. They both were working on the Vorwärts, the Yiddish paper, and Isaac Bashevis Singer was the star, and Elie was a relative newcomer. But they became friends because they took subways together at the end of the day to their West Side apartments. And at some point they had a falling out. Elie wrote a review of a Singer book that Singer was not happy about. And then Singer wrote a review of an Elie book that Elie was not happy about. And Elie writes in his memoir, he writes that they stopped speaking to each other for good. So actually, I found out later that there was one occasion they got together. But anyway, he said that they stopped speaking to each other. He says it was very sad at the end when Singer died, and very few people came to his funeral. Well, I covered the funeral for the New York Times, and the place was packed. So I think he was trying to give it additional zets, as I might say in Yiddish, to Singer. So, you know, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you.
So Elie was a saint, but he was also human.
He was human, and you know, that's what I was trying to say. His human qualities came through very well. I mean, even, you know, his struggling to start a journalism career. You know, the fact that he, even when he became famous, he didn't enjoy going out with tuxedos and being formal and all that. He was a Heimish guy, and he wanted more of that.
Yeah. Well, there were a whole bunch of things that I learned in the book that surprised me. And one of them was that, so, you know, Elie talked a number of times, he didn't know how to pump gas. And he wasn't he hadn't learned all the practical skills that the average American male or female learns growing up in the United States. And I was shocked to learn that George Borchardt, his literary agent, said that he owned a car when he first came to New York, and that he drove around New York in a car. That was news to me. That was fascinating. There were so many other really great details, like you talk a lot about his time at Boston University, first of all, teaching at City College in New York, and then at Boston University, and his students and his teaching, you know, and he was connected with so many different students from so many backgrounds. But Elie is the thesis advisor to Anwar Sadat's daughter, which is just fascinating. So they're just detail after detail. Oh, Moshe Dworkin was one of the publisher of Moment at first. I didn't know Moshe Dworkin, and I assume he's related to, I think it's Susan Dworkin. But I didn't really know any of those details because I was a kid and I wouldn't have known that. But there were just many, many details. But anyways, so is there anyone today in the Jewish community in the United States, or really anywhere, that you think comes close to Elie's stature?
No, and I say that very firmly. And sadly, because, you know, obviously with the surge of anti-Semitism, it would be wonderful to have someone like Elie, actually, who's respected by world figures, make a statement about it, or about the treatment of the immigrants on the Mexican border. I mean, Elie would have been able to make a statement that people on both sides would have listened to, because he had that kind of respect on all sides. You know, he was respected as a man of great integrity, and there's no one like that. You know, he was comparable to someone like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. You know, people who had this this kind of well-deserved charisma that came from their kind of the moral world that they projected, and to not have him has been a big loss.
I agree. I find that even though his books are assigned in many schools, and even though he's, you know, his name is famous, that first of all, a lot of people don't even know, like, they might know his name, but they don't really know why they know his name. And then I do a lot of, whenever I take like Lyfts or Ubers, I'm always asking people about questions. It's like, it's my chance to get to talk to all sorts of people, and the drivers, and many of them have never heard of Elie Wiesel. And I was wondering whether you felt that he was in danger of being forgotten.
I don't think he's in danger of being forgotten, but I think he won't be known as by as many people. And don't forget that happens with everybody. You know, when I teach at the City University, I'll bring up a person like Cary Grant. I mean, and 3/4 of the class never heard of him.
Yeah.
You know, and he was this amazing star, you know. So these things do happen to everybody. But you know, I'm hoping that my contribution with this book will keep his legacy alive for a few more people, you know.
Well, thank you for writing the book. And I think that's a good place for us to stop and go to, I see there's questions from the audience. And Suzanne, would you like to come and ask them to help us tell us some of the questions?
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful, wonderful conversation. Somebody put a comment in that I thought was interesting, so I wanted to share. They say, I teach legacy of medicine during the Holocaust for medical and nursing students and professionals. All presentations include Wiesel's quote, "Indifference for me is the epitome of evil." And they went on to say, we're trying to cultivate active moral agents. And he brought a much needed universal relevance and is so missed. So I just wanted to share that person shared that. Somebody wanted to know, when he was a professor, did he teach about the Holocaust? And was it difficult for him to do that?
He never, I won't say never, but he almost never taught about the Holocaust explicitly. But his courses,
Yes, he did one class. He tried it one time where he had a course on the Holocaust and he didn't like it, I think, right?
that's what he said. But the courses he did teach were very related. For example, the literature of persecution was a course he taught both at City College and at Boston University. So it wasn't explicitly directly about the Holocaust, but it was, you could not escape the Holocaust in that discussion. There was a wonderful moment where Elie was very open and told the students, "You can ask me anything." So in Boston, a student asked him, "Could you show us the number on your arm?" And this was a pretty that's what I'm looking for. You know, kind of intrusive question. But Elie, and Elie was also aware that there were Holocaust deniers who were saying that he lied about his time in Auschwitz. Well, Elie in class rolled up the sleeve and showed the class his number. And then he rolled the sleeve back down and said, "Next question."
Thank you.
Joe, do you happen to have the syllabus from that class, the literature of persecution?
I don't have the syllabus. I saw it, but I don't have it.
Okay, I'd love to see it.
It was in the well, you know, I actually may. Let me look through my files and see if I can find something.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked what language he wrote his books in. I know Night was not originally written in English, but what about his other books? And
he wrote in French.
In French. And what about his other books that he wrote?
All his books were written in French and translated from the French. French was his go-to language. I mean, he grew up speaking Hungarian and Yiddish, but Yiddish was neither of those languages were going to make him a world-class writer. And he learned French as an orphan in France and at the Sorbonne. So, and he was very fluent in it. So he wrote in French, and he was translated from the French.
Mm-hmm. I think he also spoke beautiful Hebrew as well, although he didn't maybe write in Hebrew. He wrote in French. But I think you talk about his Hebrew as well in the book.
Somebody wanted to know if Elie Wiesel had knew Viktor Frankl and if he ever talked about his book, Man's Search for Meaning.
I did not pursue that.
He definitely knew Primo Levi, and they had a talk about his relationship with Primo Levi in the book. And
yeah. He knew Primo Levi, and they often spoke, and he was very devastated when Levi died, and you know, he himself had a fear that he would become that despondent. So it was a very upsetting death for him.
Mm-hmm. There's a school of thought that Jewish identity is too closely connected to the victimization of the Holocaust. Do you think Elie's discussion and writing had a desirable effect on the way the world perceives Jews?
You know, it's a question I haven't tackled. I think the nobility of what he wrote and what he did could only impress people and could only cause him to be admired. So it was good for the Jews.
I think he also, he helped other Holocaust survivors to begin to give voice to their stories. And it played a very important role in doing that. And it's still this is still surging forth today. But I think that it's a very important question about, if it's gone too far or not. So.
Well, he set up a program with Random House to have survivors write their memoirs and submit them, and the best ones would get published. And they did publish about, I think, 30.
And also, because Menachem Rosensaft ran that, and also I think Menachem was also his student teacher or assistant. I don't know if it's his assistant at City College, and he said Elie really encouraged, a lot of his students were the children of Holocaust survivors, and he really encouraged people to start beginning to tell their stories or tell their parents' stories.
What was his relationship to other presidents? I know you mentioned Bill Clinton, but what about some of the other ones?
He was very close to Obama for several years, but that foundered when Netanyahu rejected the pact with Iran, the nuclear pact with Iran, which Obama had worked very hard to achieve. And Elie took the Israeli position that this was going to that it wasn't going to work, and that sanctions should be continued. And when he appeared in Washington, when Netanyahu addressed Congress, that was a slap at Obama that he took very personally. But ultimately, they revived their friendship, and Obama spoke beautifully about Elie at his death, after his death.
Well, also Ronald Reagan I didn't ask you about Bitburg. I mean, there's so much I didn't have a chance to ask you about, but he had a very important relationship with Ronald Reagan.
Well, he certainly did. He didn't have a relationship with Reagan, but the Bitburg event was very notable. What happened was Chancellor Helmut Kohl of Germany had invited Reagan to Germany and asked him to lay a wreath at the graves of soldiers in Bitburg. It turned out that among the soldiers buried there were 49 SS men, who the SS was responsible for the killing of so many Jews. So there was an uproar in the Jewish community, and people all looked to Elie to make a statement. He made a statement, but the real statement came with a very fascinating coincidence. It turned out that 2 weeks before Reagan was to leave for Germany and to lay this wreath at Bitburg, he was asked to give
He'd gotten
a Congressional Medal of Achievement, and he spoke very directly to Reagan, but in respectful tones, and said to him, I know you didn't know when you first agreed to the trip that there were SS people buried in the cemetery. But now you know, Mr. President, and now that place, Mr. President, is not your place. Your place is with the victims. And that no one could recall someone confronting a president in the White House that publicly. And it was front page news on all the papers the next day. So yes, that was his, and it turned out to be the biggest fiasco in Reagan's, maybe one of the biggest fiascos in Reagan's presidency.
And it really did help, again, propel Elie into becoming even a more important public figure than he had been before.
Absolutely, and not surprising, the next year he won the Nobel Prize. Nobel Prize for Peace. Right, yeah.
Mm-hmm. The literature.
As we wrap up, a good question is, what do you owe to Elie Wiesel's strength?
I think his upbringing with a grandfather who stressed the beauty of leading a moral life, of thinking about other people. I think that was a kind of the key nugget, and then of course, by going through the war and realizing the extent of human cruelty, he learned that this was something you had to oppose. And because he had the gifts to do it publicly, he became the Elie Wiesel we know.
I think I just want to add that there's something else about he somehow embodied that wrestling with God and wrestling with questions of morality, and that this was a Jewish life. This was the way of a Jewish life. He could embody a lot of different aspects of himself, of Judaism, of the world. He had a lot of space to do that because he had this framework of wrestling that he grew up with, or that became part of him, if that makes sense.
Oh, it's beautifully put, Nadine. Absolutely.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to end. I want to thank you, Joe and Nadine, for this wonderful conversation and for sharing new stories that so many of us have not heard before. I want to remind everybody that the book is Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will contain a link to today's program along with a link to Joe's book. Please go to momentmag.com where you can sign up for next week's program, Great Women Yiddish Writers, that we're doing with the Yiddish Book Center next week. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Suzanne.